Hello everyone and welcome to another session of AP Human Geography with Mr. Elrod. Today we're going to continue on with our discussion that we ended from our previous video, which is on subsistence agriculture. If you'll remember from our previous video, we were talking about the two main categories of agricultural practices, which are subsistence and commercial agriculture. In the previous video, we were talking about shifting cultivation or shifting subsistence cultivation. And we talked about some of its characteristics. So today we're going to talk about intensive subsistence agricultural practices, and then we're going to talk about pastoralism. Now what you'll find is that as we talk about some of these agricultural practices, you might see some of the characteristics in commercial agriculture in terms of types of crops that are grown and animals that are raised and things along those lines. Remember, a lot of the difference between subsistence and commercial agriculture is really the purpose for the agricultural practice. But not only that, whether it is labor intensive versus capital intensive, whether it is going to be on a large scale or a small scale, and if we find it in more developed or less developed countries. Those are some of the additional things that we're going to find when we're discussing subsistence and commercial agriculture. So today we're going to start off by talking about intensive subsistence agriculture. So you notice the term there, intensive subsistence. When we talk about agricultural practices that are intensive, what we mean by that, it is agricultural practices that are done over small areas of land. So we're trying to do a lot in small areas. And so the intensive subsistence, or the intensive side of this, in the intensive subsistence is agriculture that is going to be practiced in areas that are either highly populated or you have higher population densities because of the land areas and the type of land formations that you have. So you tend to find intensive subsistence in areas that either have really high populations or in relatively mountainous areas, which mean that not only do your people have less space to live on, but also you have less space to grow your crops on. And so you have to come up with some sort of method by which you're going to grow enough food in order to feed your populations. Because obviously if you can't grow enough food to feed your populations, especially in a historical context, then you're not going to be able to sustain those populations. So again, typically in areas that are highly populated, highly dense areas, either that or areas where there's not a tremendous amount of land for raising crops. So typically mountainous areas. So we find these in different parts of primarily Asia, whether it's East Asia, Southeast Asia, or South Asia, China, India, and other parts of Southeast Asia. And one of the common practices that is used in order to overcome some of the environmental difficulties of these areas is terraced farming. And so I have a couple of pictures. I have one here. And you see the terraces that are created basically by building up earthen walls and then backfilling those earthen walls with level dirt so that the areas could be planted with different types of crops. And so this is a method that's actually been used all over the world, whether it's in Asia or in parts of Latin America. It was used by some of the, I guess not ancient civilizations, we don't necessarily consider Aztec and Inca ancient civilizations, where the Incas are the ones who used it, but some of the more primitive civilizations in Latin America. Here's another, I know the picture's a little bit fuzzy, so I apologize for that, cool cat. But anyway, so you get a good idea of what the terrace looks like. And again, you're trying to take mountainous areas, hilly areas, and flatten them out, or at least create flat spaces, so that you can grow your crops and hold the soil in place so it just doesn't wash down the mountainside. Again, it is an intensive practice, which means we're doing not necessarily a lot, but we're working over a small area of land. And intensive subsistence is also going to be very labor intensive. If you look at these areas that are terraced, it's going to be very difficult to get machines into these areas and move machines into these areas. So a lot of it's going to be man-powered. You might have some animal power that's going to pull plows and things like that, but it's going to be very labor-intensive practices. In areas where there's sufficient rainfall, you're going to have rice being produced in intensive subsistence agriculture. And again, that's primarily found in parts of Asia, China and Southeast Asia. In other areas where it's a little bit drier, not as much rainfall, you will find the production of wheat, corn, and millet. I find that most students are pretty familiar with wheat and corn. Millet, maybe you're not as familiar with. It's been predominantly found in parts of Asia, kind of the grain that was found in parts of Asia historically. Another method that will be used in intensive subsistence agriculture is what's called double cropping. And so the idea of double cropping is planting two crops in one field side by side, for a variety of different reasons. You might have several things going on there. Either you're trying to create crop diversity to try and stave off any type of crop failure or anything like that. You might have a situation where one crop is going to put nutrients back into the soil, where the other absorbs those nutrients from the soil. You might have a situation where one crop is used pretty much to attract pollinating insects, like maybe a bee or other types of pollinating insects, and then so those will attract the pollinating insects that come around and then pollinate the other crops. And so you find double cropping for a variety of different reasons, but basically the idea is you're trying to be more efficient with your space. And in the same instance, and you'll find this term also used, you might have what's called ridge tillage, and I know that's not here on my PowerPoint slides, just something I kind of thought of as we were moving along here. So the other type of subsistence agriculture we're going to look at is what's called pastoralism. Now pastoralism, if you look at the root word of pastoralism, we're looking at pastor, and not necessarily from the religious standpoint, but talking about pastures, so large open spaces, wide open spaces like the Dixie Chicks talked about, areas that are going to have plenty of room for animals to grow, I guess not grow, but to be raised and to be bred and those types of things. Now it's really important to remember that animal production and meat production really is the least efficient method of growing food. Animals take a long time to mature, where they get old enough where we can eat their meat. They take large amounts of space per animal as far as their survival, so enough water to drink, enough grass to eat, those types of things. So there's a lot of energy and effort that goes into raising animals, and food production off of them, as far as if we look at animal production versus crop production, animals are much less efficient when we raise them for consumption. So pastoralism is focused strictly on the breeding and herding of animals. They're going to be raised specifically typically for their fur or their hair or their milk, and we'll talk about that in just a couple of minutes. And typically you'll find pastoralism in areas that are not necessarily hospitable for growing crops, which is why they decide to raise animals instead of crops predominantly. Again, animals are incredibly inefficient to raise, and so in order to find something that was effective to raise, then you can raise these animals. So areas that are like dry grasslands, deserts, and then also steppe areas and high elevations. Now, I don't know if sedentary pastoralism is the term for it, but really you have two types of pastoralism taking place. I call it sedentary. Basically, it's when people live in one place and they have large fields that they rotate their animals to, and typically they'll have a pen that they put their animals up in at night to protect them from predators and things along those lines. So that form of pastoralism is going to be much more localized. It's not going to be over as wide of spaces as you might have what's called nomadic pastoralism. So essentially, nomadic pastoralism is a pastoralist who roams around the countryside. He roams around large areas, driving his cattle across different seasons, and we'll talk about transhumance in just a minute. So, when you look at these sedentary versus nomadic pastoralists, they're going to be living completely different types of lifestyles. A sedentary pastoralist is going to have a house that's set down, it's not going to move. The nomadic pastoralist is going to have a house that moves relatively easily. You think about the Mongolians as nomadic pastoralists and their gers or their yurts that they use that move relatively easily. In fact, if you're not familiar with it, I would highly recommend looking at Andrew Zimmern's episode of Bizarre Foods on Mongolia, and he spends some time with some Mongolian nomadic herders, and I think it's a great eye-opening experience. So just some additional information on pastoralists. The primary animals that are going to be raised in pastoralism are cows, sheep, goats, and camels, and this is historically and also in modern terms. Again, animals in pastoralism are not necessarily raised for their meat consumption, although pastoralists will eat the animal meat occasionally. It's not what they normally do. Again, you have to think about the time, the effort, and the energy that it takes to raise the animal, and so if they ate all the animal's meat all the time, they wouldn't have any animals anymore. Primarily, they're going to use animals for their fur, for their hair, for the milk that they provide, and also to trade, whether it's fur, milk, or meat, or things like that, for other elements to provide for their family and to eat. We typically find pastoralists, again, in less developed countries, less developed parts of the world. You have to think about the amount of space that's required in order to have a pastoralist. And so if you have a lot of development, cities, rural towns, things like that growing up, then it's going to be very difficult to be a pastoralist. And so that's actually one of the issues that pastoralists run into. So we find them in parts of North Africa, find them in parts of Central and South Africa, parts of the Middle East or Southwest Asia, and then also in parts of Central Asia. And I spoke about Mongolia just a second ago. When we talk about nomads who move with their cattle, there's this movement pattern called transhumance, where the nomadic pastoralists are going to move their cattle based upon the seasons. Which in the summertime they move to the highlands where it's a little bit cooler, and during the wintertime they move to the lowlands to protect their cattle from the elements and use the hills and things as kind of a buffer against the wind and the cold. So that's all that we have time for today, except I do believe we have time for a quiz ferret. Our furry friend Quiz Ferret has popped its head out of the ground and has a question for us, so let's see how you do. So the question today is, I guess I should be a question mark, shouldn't I? I apologize for my poor grammar. And don't try to read the answer. Oh, no, can't have exclamation mark and question mark. Oh, there we go, question mark. Apologize for my poor grammar. Which category of agricultural practice is most likely found in less developed countries? Pause the video, see how you do. And that is subsistence agriculture. And we spoke about that in our previous video, and I mentioned it some in this video. But anyway, that's all that we have time for today. I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comment box below, and I will get back to you as soon as possible. And I hope to see you next time.